St. Mary's General Hospital, a beacon of medical excellence nestled within an affluent suburban community, was about to face an unexpected upheaval. Angela Parker, a talented black nurse, had just joined their team, unaware of the deep-seated biases she would encounter. As tensions rose and conflicts escalated, a seemingly ordinary patient named Thomas Edwards watched quietly from his hospital bed. But Mr. Edwards was far from ordinary, and his presence would soon alter the course of events. The hidden power he wielded and how Angela's struggles might become a catalyst for institutional change lay at the heart of the unfolding story. Before diving into this tale of unexpected twists and moments of justice, let us know in the comments where you're watching from today. If you enjoy stories with compelling turns and thought-provoking resolutions, don't forget to subscribe. The pristine halls of St. Mary's General Hospital gleamed under fluorescent lights as Angela Parker took her first steps into the facility. The air was heavy with the antiseptic scent of disinfectant, and an undercurrent of tension seemed to pulse through the corridors, twisting her stomach into knots. Despite the anxiety gnawing at her, Angela straightened her spine and lifted her chin, determined to make a strong first impression. As she approached the nurse's station, Angela noticed the atmosphere shift. Conversations hushed to murmurs before fading altogether. Glances flickered in her direction, then quickly averted, as though direct eye contact might conjure something unspeakable. She swallowed hard, pushing down the familiar sting of isolation that threatened to overwhelm her. "Excuse me," Angela began, her voice steady despite her nerves. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse. Could you direct me to the head nurse's office?" A blonde nurse seated behind the desk looked up, her icy blue eyes meeting Angela's for the briefest of moments before darting away. The blonde nurse's eyes widened slightly before a polished smile graced her face. "Of course," she said with measured politeness. "Down the hallway, third door on the right." Angela nodded and made her way down the corridor, acutely aware of the eyes trailing her progress. The sharp clicks of her sensible shoes echoed loudly in the unnervingly quiet space, each step reverberating like thunder. As she neared the designated office, a tall, commanding man in a white coat emerged from a nearby room. His salt and pepper hair and authoritative demeanor marked him as a senior doctor. Angela's heart quickened with cautious optimism. Perhaps this would be an opportunity for a positive connection. "Good morning, doctor," she greeted warmly, her smile genuine. "I'm Angela Parker, the new nurse starting today. It's a pleasure to meet you." The doctor's steely gray eyes scanned her briefly, his expression indifferent. "Dr. Williams," he replied curtly. "I trust you've been properly oriented to our procedures." Before Angela could respond, Dr. Williams continued, his tone clipped. "We maintain very high standards here at St. Mary's. I trust you'll be prepared to meet them." Without waiting for a reply, he swept past her, leaving Angela standing alone in the hallway. Her extended hand slowly dropped to her side. The interaction deflated her, but Angela refused to let it dampen her spirits. She drew in a steadying breath, composed herself, and knocked on the head nurse's office door. While waiting for a response, her thoughts wandered back to her nursing school days, her mother's words echoing in her mind. "My little girl," her mother had said, her voice a blend of pride and concern, "you'll have to work twice as hard as everyone else, but don't ever let them see you sweat. You come from a long line of strong women, and that same strength is in you." Angela remembered the late nights spent studying, the extra hours in the lab, and the constant pressure to prove herself. She recalled the subtle dismissals from certain professors, their raised eyebrows when she aced exams, and the whispered remarks from classmates questioning her place. But through it all, Angela had persevered. She graduated at the top of her class, her determination and skill silencing even her harshest critics. Now, standing in the halls of St. Mary's, Angela drew strength from those memories. She had overcome obstacles before, and she would do so again. The door creaked open, revealing a stern-faced, middle-aged woman. "Ms. Parker, I presume," the woman said, her tone clipped. "We have a lot to discuss, and I expect you to keep up." As Angela followed the head nurse into the office, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was stepping into more than just a new job. The atmosphere at St. Mary's General Hospital felt thick with unspoken tension, a silent storm brewing beneath the surface of professional smiles and antiseptic efficiency. Angela Parker had no idea that her presence would soon become the catalyst for change, challenging entrenched biases and exposing the toxic culture hidden beneath the hospital's prestigious facade. The rest of Angela's first day passed in a whirlwind of orientation sessions and an overwhelming amount of paperwork. As she navigated the hospital's maze-like hallways, she couldn't help but notice the subtle ways she was excluded. Polite but distant responses from her colleagues left her feeling like an outsider in what should have been a collaborative environment. By the end of her shift, Angela was mentally and emotionally drained. As she packed her belongings into her locker, she overheard two nurses whispering nearby. "Did you see the new hire?" one murmured. "Yeah," the other replied. "I don't know what they were thinking. This isn't exactly the neighborhood for someone like her, you know." Angela's hands froze on the locker door, her heart sinking. She had hoped the initial coldness was just first-day nerves, but the reality of her situation was becoming painfully clear. This wasn't just a new job. It was going to be a daily battle against prejudice and deeply ingrained biases. As she left the hospital, the weight of the day pressed heavily on her shoulders. Walking to the bus stop, her mind swirled with a storm of emotions. The excitement she'd felt that morning had been replaced by doubt and isolation. Sitting on the hard plastic seat of the bus stop, Angela pulled out her phone and dialed a familiar number. After 2 rings, a warm and comforting voice answered. "Hey, baby girl, how was your first day?" her mother asked. Hearing her mother's voice, Angela felt tears prick at the corners of her eyes. She took a shaky breath, determined not to break down in public. "It was a challenge, Mama," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. The line went silent for a moment before her mother spoke again, her tone full of understanding and strength. "Angela Marie Parker, you listen to me. You've worked too hard to let anyone make you feel less than. Remember who you are and where you come from. You're not just there for yourself. You're there for every little black girl who dreams of standing in those halls one day." Angela closed her eyes, letting her mother's words wash over her. "I know, Mama. It's just, I didn't expect it to be this hard." "Nothing worth doing is ever easy, baby," her mother replied. "But you have the strength of generations behind you. Hold your head high, do your work better than anyone else, and don't you dare let them see you falter. Do you hear me?" "Yes, Mama," Angela said, a newfound determination rising within her. "I hear you." As she ended the call, a sleek black Mercedes rolled past the bus stop, slowing briefly. Through its tinted window, Angela caught a glimpse of Dr. Greaves, his piercing eyes fixed on her for a moment before the car sped away. Straightening her shoulders, Angela felt her mother's words echoing in her mind. She might be facing an uphill battle, but she wasn't alone. With her family's strength behind her and her determination to prove herself, Angela knew she could overcome whatever challenges St. Mary's threw her way. When the bus finally arrived, Angela was ready to face another day. Little did she know, her presence at St. Mary's was about to set off a chain of events that would challenge the hospital's very foundation, exposing long-hidden prejudices and forcing long-overdue accountability. Weeks later, St. Mary's. Each day at St. Mary's unfolded like a slow-burning fuse, layering tension upon tension in Angela's already challenging work environment. The coldness she experienced on her first day had evolved into a more insidious form of exclusion, subtle yet undeniable. As Angela conducted her morning rounds, she couldn't ignore the stark differences in how she was treated compared to her white colleagues. Dr. William Greaves, in particular, seemed to take pleasure in scrutinizing her every move, no matter how diligently she performed her duties. "Nurse Parker," Dr. Greaves called out one morning, his voice carrying across the busy nurses' station. "I trust you're well acquainted with our protocols by now. We can't afford any mistakes." His tone, sharp and condescending, cut through the bustling atmosphere like a knife. Angela straightened, meeting his gaze with quiet resolve. "Yes, doctor," she replied evenly, her hands steady as she reviewed her charts. Inside, however, the tension simmered. Every interaction with Dr. Greaves felt like walking a tightrope, his eyes constantly searching for a misstep. Dr. Greaves emphasized the word mistake in a way that sent a chill down Angela's spine. She met his gaze squarely, refusing to be intimidated. "Of course, doctor. Let me assure you, I am fully proficient in all of the hospital's procedures." Dr. Greaves raised an eyebrow, his lips curling into a smug smile. "We'll see about that," he replied. "I wouldn't expect you to have learned everything you need to know just yet." The thinly veiled condescension in his tone was impossible to miss, not only for Angela, but also for the other nurses, who pretended to be engrossed in their tasks while clearly eavesdropping. As Dr. Greaves strode away, Angela felt the weight of his unspoken judgment settle heavily on her shoulders. The rest of the day seemed to reinforce that weight. She was consistently assigned the most difficult tasks and undesirable cases, while her white colleagues were given comparatively simple assignments. Angela found herself dealing with the most demanding patients and the most intricate procedures. "Angela, could you help move Mr. Johnson to room 305? A fellow nurse asked with an overly sweet tone. "He's being a bit of a challenge today." Angela nodded, knowing full well that a bit of a challenge was an understatement. Mr. Johnson was infamous for his outbursts, many of which were racially charged, and had reduced 2 nurses to tears that week alone. But Angela approached the task with steady professionalism, determined to prove her worth. As she entered Mr. Johnson's room, she braced herself for the inevitable tirade. Sure enough, the moment he saw her, his face twisted with disgust. "What are you doing here?" he spat. "I told them I don't want no colored nurse touching me." Angela took a deep breath, steadying herself against the sting of his words. "Mr. Johnson, I'm here to check your vitals and change your dressings. I assure you I am more than capable of taking care of you." Throughout the procedure, Angela endured a barrage of hateful remarks and racial slurs. Yet she remained calm, completing her task with precision and care. She refused to let Mr. Johnson's prejudice affect the quality of her work. When she finally stepped out of the room, she was met by Dr. Greaves, standing in the hallway with a feigned look of concern. "Everything all right in there, Nurse Parker? We could hear quite the commotion," he said, his tone dripping with insincerity. Angela met his gaze firmly. "Mr. Johnson's vitals are stable, and his dressings have been changed. Is there anything else you need from me, doctor?" For a moment, surprise flickered across Dr. Greaves' face, quickly replaced by his usual air of superiority. "Well, let's hope you can maintain that level of calm with all your patients. We wouldn't want any complaints now, would we?" he said before walking away. As Angela watched him go, she couldn't shake the feeling that she had just passed some kind of unspoken test, a test she should never have had to take in the first place. The remainder of Angela's shift passed in a haze of endless tasks and subtle indignities. She found herself double and triple checking her work, not because she doubted her abilities, but because she knew even the smallest mistake would be magnified and used against her. As the day wore on, Angela couldn't help but notice how her white colleagues seemed to breeze through their shifts, chatting and laughing while she struggled under the weight of an inequitable workload. The disparity was glaring, yet every time she considered speaking up, the memory of her mother's words stopped her. As Angela packed her belongings at the end of her shift, exhaustion weighed heavily on her, both physically and emotionally. She overheard 2 nurses whispering nearby. "Can you believe the fuss they're making?" one of them said, her tone dripping with disdain. "Diversity hire, they call it. Honestly, they'll never keep up with us." Angela's hand froze on the locker door, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted nothing more than to confront them, to defend herself and her capabilities. But she knew any confrontation would only reinforce their biases. Instead, she quietly closed her locker and walked out of the hospital, holding her head high despite the day's weight bearing down on her shoulders. At the bus stop, Angela stood waiting when the sleek black Mercedes she'd seen earlier pulled up beside her. The window rolled down, revealing Dr. Greaves behind the wheel. "Nurse Parker," he called out, his voice oozing with faux concern. "Waiting for the bus again? Shame. I suppose that's all a nurse's salary affords, isn't it?" Before Angela could respond, Dr. Greaves sped off, leaving her standing there humiliated and seething. The casual cruelty of his words cut deep, serving as a stark reminder of the uphill battle she faced daily at St. Mary's. As she boarded the bus, Angela's mind swirled with emotions. The excitement and hope she'd felt when she first started at St. Mary's seemed like a distant memory, now replaced by a grim determination to endure this hostile environment. Yet amidst the turmoil, a quiet voice in the back of her mind whispered that something had to give. The question was whether she would break under the relentless pressure, or if her perseverance would eventually spark change within St. Mary's toxic culture. Little did Angela know, an unexpected ally was about to enter her life, a force that would tip the scales in her favor and expose the deeply rooted biases hidden within St. Mary's prestigious walls. As the bus rumbled through the darkened streets, Angela closed her eyes. Drawing strength from the memory of her mother's words and the resilient legacy coursing through her veins. Tomorrow would be another battle, but she was determined to face it, no matter what challenges awaited her. The next morning, Angela arrived at St. Mary's with renewed resolve. She had spent the night reflecting on her experiences and reminding herself why she had chosen to become a nurse in the first place, to help others, regardless of their circumstances or her own challenges. As she walked toward the nurses' station, she noticed an unusual buzz of activity. Nurses were bustling about, preparing rooms, and there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the air. Curious, Angela approached a colleague to ask about the commotion. For a moment, the usual coldness her colleague showed toward Angela was forgotten. "We've got a VIP patient coming in," the nurse said, her tone laced with excitement. "Apparently they had some kind of skiing accident. Both arms are broken, from what I've heard." Before Angela could ask more, the nurse was pulled away by another task. Dr. Greaves approached Angela with his usual stern expression. "Nurse Parker," he said, his tone clipped, "I need you to handle the admission of Mr. Thomas Edwards in room 412. He suffered a severe skiing accident and has both arms broken. I expect you to provide him with the utmost care and attention." Angela nodded, recognizing the task as yet another test. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied evenly. "I'll see to it immediately." As she made her way to room 412, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was different. The palpable importance surrounding this patient made her wonder if there was more to his situation than met the eye. Entering the room, she was greeted by the sight of a middle-aged man lying in bed, both arms encased in casts. Despite his injuries, there was an air of quiet composure about him that immediately caught Angela's attention. "Good morning," Angela said warmly, approaching his bedside. "I'm Nurse Angela Parker, and I'll be taking care of you during your stay with us." Mr. Edwards looked up, his sharp eyes meeting hers with a calm yet assessing gaze. "Good morning, Nurse Parker," he replied in a voice that was surprisingly strong for his condition. "I appreciate your help. I must admit I didn't expect to find myself here after a skiing mishap." As Angela began checking his vitals and assessing his condition, she couldn't help but notice how intently he observed her every move. Unlike some other patients, there was no trace of judgment or disdain in his demeanor, just a deep curiosity. "You seem very capable, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards remarked as she adjusted his IV. "How long have you been at St. Mary's?" Angela paused, caught off guard by the genuine interest in his tone. "I've been here a few weeks, sir," she replied cautiously. "It's been quite the experience so far." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow at her diplomatic answer. "I see," he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. "And how do you find the hospital? Does it live up to its prestigious reputation?" Angela hesitated, unsure how to respond. She was spared from answering when Dr. Greaves burst into the room, his demeanor unusually jovial, something Angela had never seen before. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves exclaimed, his voice dripping with artificial warmth. "I trust Nurse Parker has been taking excellent care of you. We assign only our best staff to our most distinguished patients." Angela maintained her professional demeanor, though she couldn't ignore the hypocrisy in Dr. Greaves' words. He had never shown such confidence in her abilities before. Mr. Edwards seemed to pick up on the inconsistency as well. "Indeed, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his sharp eyes flicking between the doctor and Angela. "I was just asking Nurse Parker about her experiences here at St. Mary's." Dr. Greaves hesitated, his smile faltering for a moment before quickly recovering. "Well, I'm sure she'll tell you that everything is wonderful. We pride ourselves on our inclusive and supportive environment at St. Mary's." Angela felt a wave of anger rise at Dr. Greaves' blatant hypocrisy, but she kept her professionalism intact. Mr. Edwards, however, appeared to sense the underlying tension. "I look forward to experiencing this supportive environment firsthand during my stay," Mr. Edwards said, his tone calm but laden with meaning. As Dr. Greaves launched into a detailed explanation of Mr. Edwards' treatment plan, Angela couldn't shake the feeling that she had just witnessed something significant. There was something about the way Mr. Edwards observed her, the keen edge to his questions, as though he were looking past St. Mary's polished exterior to its deeper flaws. Encouraged by the lack of consequences for his behavior, Dr. Greaves became increasingly blatant in his efforts to undermine Angela. One morning, as Angela reviewed patient charts at the nurse's station, Dr. Greaves approached with a towering stack of files. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice laced with feigned concern, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging, but I trust you'll manage." Angela glanced at the files, immediately realizing the workload was nearly double that of her colleagues. She met Dr. Greaves' gaze steadily, refusing to let him see any sign of intimidation. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied calmly. "I'll get right on it." As he walked away, a smug smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. Angela overheard him mutter under his breath, "Let's see how she handles this." Throughout the day, Angela found herself rushing from one difficult case to the next, barely finding time to catch her breath. The patients assigned to her were some of the most demanding in the hospital, many with complex medical needs or challenging personalities. Despite the overwhelming workload, Angela refused to let her standards slip. She approached each patient with care and professionalism, even as the mounting exhaustion began to take its toll. However, the relentless pressure was wearing on her. As Angela hurried to respond to another call, she overheard two of her colleagues whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're making her handle all the critical cases?" one said. "I have to admit," the other replied, "it's impressive how she keeps going. I'd have cracked by now." Angela felt a mix of anger and hurt, realizing her colleagues were not only aware of the unfair treatment she was enduring, but were actively observing to see if she would fail. The emotional weight of the day drove her back to Mr. Edwards' room more often than usual. Unlike the rest of the hospital, his room had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could catch her breath and feel, if only for a moment, that someone saw her worth. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards greeted her warmly as she entered for a routine check. "You look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Angela forced a weak smile. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards. Nothing I can't handle?" Mr. Edwards studied her face for a moment, his sharp eyes full of concern. "You know," he said carefully, "there's a difference between merely handling something and growing from it. From what I've seen, you're more than capable of the latter." His words, though kind, only served to highlight the stark contrast between his treatment of her and that of the hospital staff. Angela felt her throat tighten, the weight of isolation threatening to overwhelm her. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I appreciate your kindness." As she turned to leave, Mr. Edwards called out again. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice steady yet authoritative. "Remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to speak up." Angela left the room, her mind racing with the implications of his words. As she returned to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Little did she know the next day would bring a series of events that would push her to her limits and force her to confront the biases she had endured since her first day at St. Mary's. The next morning, Angela arrived at work to find the hospital in a state of heightened activity. Rumors swirled about a high-stakes emergency surgery scheduled for later that day, with several hospital board members and important guests expected to attend. The anxious energy was palpable as Angela observed the nurses and doctors preparing under the immense pressure. Amidst her morning tasks, Dr. Greaves approached Angela, his eyes glinting in a way that immediately put her on edge. "Nurse Parker," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "we need you to assist in the emergency surgery this afternoon. It's a critical case, and I trust you're prepared to handle it." Angela felt a surprising mix of pride and suspicion. Being asked to assist in such a significant surgery was typically an honor, but coming from Dr. Greaves, she couldn't help but question his motives. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "I'll be ready." As Dr. Greaves walked away, Angela overheard him mutter to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The hours leading up to the surgery blurred into a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Angela threw herself into her work, double and triple checking everything to ensure she was as prepared as possible for whatever challenges lay ahead. She couldn't help but notice the skeptical glances from some of the other staff, but she took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. Her mother's words echoed in her mind, "You don't dare let them see you falter." As the surgery began, Angela found herself working alongside Dr. Greaves and several other senior staff members. Encouraged by the lack of consequences for his behavior, Dr. Greaves became increasingly blatant in his efforts to undermine Angela. One morning, as Angela reviewed patient charts at the nurse's station, Dr. Greaves approached with a towering stack of files. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice laced with feigned concern, "I need you to handle these cases today. They're particularly challenging, but I trust you'll manage." Angela glanced at the files, immediately realizing the workload was nearly double that of her colleagues. She met Dr. Greaves' gaze steadily, refusing to let him see any sign of intimidation. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied calmly. "I'll get right on it." As he walked away, a smug smirk tugged at the corners of his mouth. Angela overheard him mutter under his breath, "Let's see how she handles this." Throughout the day, Angela found herself rushing from one difficult case to the next, barely finding time to catch her breath. The patients assigned to her were some of the most demanding in the hospital, many with complex medical needs or challenging personalities. Despite the overwhelming workload, Angela refused to let her standards slip. She approached each patient with care and professionalism, even as the mounting exhaustion began to take its toll. However, the relentless pressure was wearing on her. As Angela hurried to respond to another call, she overheard two of her colleagues whispering nearby. "Can you believe they're making her handle all the critical cases?" one said. "I have to admit," the other replied, "it's impressive how she keeps going. I'd have cracked by now." Angela felt a mix of anger and hurt, realizing her colleagues were not only aware of the unfair treatment she was enduring, but were actively observing to see if she would fail. The emotional weight of the day drove her back to Mr. Edwards' room more often than usual. Unlike the rest of the hospital, his room had become a sanctuary for her, a place where she could catch her breath and feel, if only for a moment, that someone saw her worth. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards greeted her warmly as she entered for a routine check. "You look exhausted. Is everything all right?" Angela forced a weak smile. "Just a busy day, Mr. Edwards. Nothing I can't handle." Mr. Edwards studied her face for a moment, his sharp eyes full of concern. "You know," he said carefully, "there's a difference between merely handling something and growing from it. From what I've seen, you're more than capable of the latter." His words, though kind, only served to highlight the stark contrast between his treatment of her and that of the hospital staff. Angela felt her throat tighten, the weight of isolation threatening to overwhelm her. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. "I appreciate your kindness." As she turned to leave, Mr. Edwards called out again. "Nurse Parker," he said, his voice steady yet authoritative, "remember that sometimes the greatest strength lies in knowing when to speak up." Angela left the room, her mind racing with the implications of his words. As she returned to the nurse's station, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. Little did she know, the next day would bring a series of events that would push her to her limits and force her to confront the biases she had endured since her first day at St. Mary's. The next morning, Angela arrived at work to find the hospital in a state of heightened activity. Rumors swirled about a high-stakes emergency surgery scheduled for later that day, with several hospital board members and important guests expected to attend. The anxious energy was palpable as Angela observed the nurses and doctors preparing under the immense pressure. Amidst her morning tasks, Dr. Greaves approached Angela, his eyes glinting in a way that immediately put her on edge. "Nurse Parker," he began, his tone carefully neutral, "we need you to assist in the emergency surgery this afternoon. It's a critical case, and I trust you're prepared to handle it." Angela felt a surprising mix of pride and suspicion. Being asked to assist in such a significant surgery was typically an honor, but coming from Dr. Greaves, she couldn't help but question his motives. "Of course, Dr. Greaves," she replied, keeping her tone steady. "I'll be ready." As Dr. Greaves walked away, Angela overheard him mutter to another doctor, "Let's see how she handles the pressure. This should be interesting." The hours leading up to the surgery blurred into a whirlwind of preparation and anticipation. Angela threw herself into her work, double and triple checking everything to ensure she was as prepared as possible for whatever challenges lay ahead. She couldn't help but notice the skeptical glances from some of the other staff, but she took a deep breath, focusing on the task at hand. Her mother's words echoed in her mind. "You don't dare let them see you falter." As the surgery began, Angela found herself working alongside Dr. Greaves and several other senior staff members. Angela remained composed despite the heightened tension in the operating room. She moved with precision, anticipating the surgeon's needs and handing them instruments before they even asked. Her years of training and experience shone through as the operation progressed. However, she noticed something that made her heart race. Dr. Greaves, typically so confident and assured, appeared hesitant. His hand trembled slightly as he prepared to make a critical incision. In a split second, Angela realized that Dr. Greaves was on the verge of making a potentially life-threatening mistake. Without hesitation, she spoke up. "Dr. Greaves," she said, her voice clear and steady, "perhaps we should consider approaching the patient from a different angle. The anatomy suggests it may be safer." The room fell silent. All eyes turned to Angela. Dr. Greaves looked at her, his face a mix of surprise and anger. For a moment, Angela thought he might dismiss her suggestion outright, but then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. Adjusting his approach as per Angela's recommendation, the surgery continued, and it became evident that her intervention might have saved the patient's life. When the operation concluded successfully, Angela could feel the weight of the many eyes on her. Some staff looked at her with newfound respect, while others, including Dr. Greaves, seemed to simmer with barely concealed resentment. As they began cleaning up, Dr. Greaves turned to Angela, his voice low and menacing. "Nurse Parker, I need to see you in private. Immediately." Angela followed him out of the operating room, her heart pounding. She knew speaking up had been the right thing to do, but she also knew it could cost her job. To her surprise, Dr. Greaves led her to Mr. Edwards' room. In the chaos of the surgery, Angela had forgotten that Mr. Edwards was still a patient in the hospital. However, Dr. Greaves seemed too furious to notice or care about the setting. As soon as the door closed behind them, Dr. Greaves rounded on Angela, his face flushed with fury. "How dare you question my judgment in there?" he hissed, his voice dripping with venom. "Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? You're lucky I don't fire you on the spot for such insubordination." Angela stood her ground, her voice calm but firm. "Dr. Greaves, I was simply doing my job, ensuring the safety of the patient, which is our top priority." Dr. Greaves interrupted, his voice rising. "Your job is to follow orders. Don't think for a second that you know better than your superiors. This is exactly why people like you don't belong in an institution as prestigious as St. Mary's. You're here because of some misguided attempt at diversity, not because you have any real skill or knowledge." As Dr. Greaves continued his tirade, his words grew increasingly racist and hostile. Angela felt a mix of anger and despair. Every microaggression and slight she had endured paled in comparison to this overt display of prejudice. Just as she prepared to respond, a voice cut through the room, stopping Dr. Greaves mid-sentence. "I believe you've forgotten where you are and who you're speaking to." Both Angela and Dr. Greaves turned, startled, to see Mr. Edwards sitting upright in his bed, his face a mask of restrained anger. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves stammered, his complexion pale as he realized the gravity of his mistake. I didn't realize you were awake. My apologies for disturbing you." "Oh, I'm very much awake, Dr. Greaves," Mr. Edwards replied, his voice cold and measured. "And I've been awake long enough to witness the disgraceful way you and others in this hospital have treated Nurse Parker." Angela froze, unable to believe what she was hearing. The quiet, unassuming patient suddenly radiated authority, his presence dominating the room. "Mr. Edwards," Dr. Greaves began, his voice trembling slightly, "I assure you, there has been a misunderstanding." "There is no misunderstanding," Mr. Edwards cut him off sharply. "What I have witnessed during my time here," Mr. Edwards said, his tone sharp and unyielding, "is a blatant pattern of discrimination and harassment, and it ends now." His words hung heavily in the air, and both Angela and Dr. Greaves realized that Mr. Edwards was far more than just a VIP patient. There was an undeniable authority in his voice, a power that commanded attention. "And who exactly are you?" Dr. Greaves asked, his earlier bravado entirely evaporated. Mr. Edwards smiled, but it was a cold, calculated smile devoid of warmth. "I am someone who has the power to make or break the future of this hospital. And right now, Dr. Greaves, I find myself disinclined to support an institution that permits such blatant racism and unprofessional behavior." As the weight of the situation settled, Angela felt a surge of mixed emotions, relief that someone had finally seen and acknowledged the treatment she endured, anger at the injustice she had faced, and a cautious hope that perhaps, at long last, change was on the horizon. The tension in Mr. Edwards' room was palpable. Dr. Greaves' face turned ashen as he tried to regain his composure. Angela remained silent, her mind racing as she processed the sudden shift in dynamics. Mr. Edwards, now sitting fully upright in his bed, fixed Dr. Greaves with a steely gaze. "I believe it's time we had an honest discussion about the culture of this hospital, don't you think?" Mr. Edwards said. Before Dr. Greaves could respond, there was a knock at the door. A nurse peeked in, her face etched with unease. "Dr. Greaves, the hospital administrator is looking for you. It's urgent." Dr. Greaves glanced between Mr. Edwards and the nurse, clearly torn. Finally, he gave a curt nod. "We'll continue this discussion later." Turning to Angela, he added, "Nurse Parker, you are dismissed for now." As Dr. Greaves left the room in haste, Angela found herself alone with Mr. Edwards. A heavy silence lingered between them, filled with unspoken words. "Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards finally said, his voice gentler now, "I think it's time I properly introduced myself. My name is Thomas Edwards, and I am the CEO of Healthcare United, one of the largest healthcare organizations in the country." Angela's eyes widened in shock. Healthcare United was a powerhouse in the medical world, renowned for its influence and resources. Suddenly, Mr. Edwards' earlier comments about having the power to shape the hospital's future made complete sense. "Mr. Edwards, Angela began, unsure of what to say. "Please, take a seat," Mr. Edwards interrupted, gesturing to the chair beside his bed. "I believe we have much to discuss." Over the next hour, Mr. Edwards revealed that his stay at St. Mary's had not been planned. His skiing accident had been an unfortunate detour, but it had opened his eyes to the deep-seated issues within the hospital. "I came here as a patient expecting nothing more than quality medical care," Mr. Edwards explained. "Instead, I have witnessed a culture of discrimination and unprofessionalism that goes against everything I stand for as a leader in healthcare." He described how he had observed the subtle and overt discrimination Angela faced, along with the toxic environment that seemed to permeate the institution. "What you have endured, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said, his voice filled with both anger and determination, "is unfortunately not unique. But it is unacceptable, and it ends now." For the first time since Angela had started at St. Mary's, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. She felt seen and heard in a way she hadn't thought possible. As she shared her experiences with Mr. Edwards, he listened intently, his expression growing graver with each revelation. "Thank you for your honesty, Nurse Parker," Mr. Edwards said when she finished. "Your resilience in the face of such adversity is commendable. But change cannot rest solely on individual perseverance. It's time to overhaul the system." Their conversation was interrupted by another knock at the door. The hospital administrator entered, her expression flustered and uneasy. "Mr. Edwards," she began, her voice trembling slightly, "I understand there are some concerns about our hospital's operations. I assure you we take these matters very seriously." Mr. Edwards raised an eyebrow, his voice cutting through her attempt at reassurance. "Do you? Because from what I've observed, the only thing being taken seriously here is the maintenance of an outdated, discriminatory status quo." The administrator paled, clearly unprepared for such direct criticism. "I'm not sure I understand," she stammered. "We have diversity initiatives in place." "Initiatives aren't enough," Mr. Edwards interrupted. "What you need is a complete cultural overhaul of this hospital, and that starts at the top." For the next few hours, Mr. Edwards laid out his demands for change. He called for a full investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory inclusion and diversity training for all staff, and a complete reform of St. Mary's hiring and promotion processes. Turning to Dr. Greaves specifically, his voice was firm. "I expect his behavior to be thoroughly investigated. His actions today were not only unprofessional but discriminatory and potentially dangerous to patient care." The administrator, grasping the gravity of the situation, nodded silently. "Of course, Mr. Edwards. We will begin implementing these changes immediately." As the day wore on, news of Mr. Edwards' true identity and his demands for transformation spread like wildfire through the hospital. The once pristine facade of St. Mary's cracked, exposing the long-festering issues beneath. The atmosphere was electric, a mix of fear and hope permeating every corner of the institution. Angela, still processing the whirlwind of events, found herself the center of attention. Colleagues who had previously ignored or dismissed her now approached her, some offering clumsy apologies, others seeking her insight into the upcoming changes. It was a dizzying reversal, one Angela met with cautious optimism. When her shift ended, Angela made her way to Mr. Edwards' room one last time. He was sitting up in bed, looking tired but satisfied. "Nurse Parker," he greeted her with a warm smile, "I hope you don't mind, but I've recommended you for a position on the newly established Diversity and Inclusion Committee. Your experiences and insights will be invaluable as we work to transform St. Mary's." Angela felt a surge of emotion, gratitude, hope, and a newfound sense of purpose. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Mr. Edwards shook his head. "No thank you, Nurse Parker. Your courage and professionalism in the face of adversity have been inspiring. You've reminded me why I got into healthcare in the first place, to make a difference in people's lives." As Angela left the hospital that evening, she couldn't help but feel that a new chapter was beginning. Not just for her, but for St. Mary's as a whole. The road ahead would be challenging, but for the first time since she had arrived, Angela felt genuine hope for the future. The changes initiated that day sent ripples far beyond St. Mary's. The story of a dedicated nurse and an influential patient was poised to become the catalyst for large-scale reform in the healthcare industry. In the days that followed, St. Mary's became a whirlwind of activity and emotion. The revelation of Mr. Edwards' true identity and his calls for reform sent shockwaves through the institution. By early Monday morning, Angela arrived at the hospital to find a media frenzy outside. News vans lined the street, reporters clamoring for statements from anyone willing to speak. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Staff gathered in small clusters, whispering frantically. As Angela approached the nurses' station, she noticed Dr. Greaves being escorted by security to the administrative office. As Angela locked eyes briefly with Dr. Greaves, she saw a flicker of anger mixed with fear before he was escorted away. A voice interrupted her thoughts, and she turned to see Sarah, one of the nurses who had previously been cold toward her, approaching with a sheepish smile. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry," Sarah began awkwardly, "for the way I treated you. I didn't realize—" Angela nodded, acknowledging the apology, though she wasn't sure how to respond. Before she could say anything, a voice crackled over the hospital's PA system. "All staff are required to attend an emergency meeting in the main auditorium in 30 minutes. Attendance is mandatory." By the time Angela arrived at the auditorium, it was packed. She found a seat near the back, acutely aware of the curious glances and murmurs that followed her. At the front of the room stood Mr. Edwards, now dressed in a tailored suit despite the casts on his arms. He was engaged in quiet conversation with the hospital administrator and several other authoritative-looking figures. When the room settled, Mr. Edwards stepped up to the podium, his commanding presence instantly silencing the crowd. "Good morning," he began, his voice firm and authoritative. "For those who don't know me, I'm Thomas Edwards, CEO of Healthcare United. Over the past week, I've been a patient here at St. Mary's, recovering from a skiing accident. During this time, I have had the opportunity to observe the day-to-day operations and culture of this hospital." He paused, letting his gaze sweep across the room. "What I witnessed was deeply troubling. I observed a culture of bias, discrimination, and unprofessional behavior that has no place in modern healthcare." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others nodded in agreement. "Let me be clear," Mr. Edwards continued. "The events I witnessed, particularly the treatment of Nurse Angela Parker, are not isolated incidents. They are symptoms of a systemic issue that has persisted for far too long." Angela felt every eye in the room turn toward her. She straightened her back, meeting their gazes with quiet resolve. Mr. Edwards went on to outline immediate changes, including a thorough investigation into discriminatory practices, mandatory inclusion and diversity training for all staff, and a complete overhaul of the hospital's recruitment and promotion processes. His voice hardened as he added, "Those found guilty of discriminatory behavior will face serious consequences, including Dr. William Greaves, who has been suspended pending a full investigation into his conduct." The announcement sent another wave of whispers through the crowd. Angela noticed some longtime supporters of Dr. Greaves looking shocked and angry, while others seemed relieved. "I understand these changes may be difficult for some of you," Mr. Edwards continued. "But let me be clear. This is not just about doing what is ethically right. It's about ensuring we provide the best possible care for our patients. A diverse, inclusive, and respectful workplace leads to better outcomes for everyone." As Mr. Edwards concluded his speech, he made one final announcement that left the room stunned. "I'd like to introduce you to the person who will lead many of these changes. Nurse Angela Parker has agreed to take on the role of Diversity and Inclusion Director at St. Mary's. Her experience and insights will be invaluable as we transform this organization." Angela felt a mix of pride and anxiety wash over her as applause filled the room. She hadn't expected this announcement. Her previous discussions with Mr. Edwards had only been about joining the diversity committee. As she walked to the front of the room at Mr. Edwards' gesture, she noticed the range of emotions on her colleagues' faces, respect in some, lingering resentment in others. Standing at the podium, Angela took a deep breath before addressing the room. "Thank you, Mr. Edwards. And to all of you, I want to say this. I stand before you not as an adversary, but as a colleague who believes in the potential of St. Mary's and everyone in this room. The road ahead will not be easy, but I am committed to working alongside all of you to create a hospital where every employee feels valued and every patient receives the best possible care, regardless of their circumstances." As Angela spoke, she could see the impact of her words. Some employees nodded in agreement, while others looked thoughtful. Even those who had been openly hostile toward her appeared to be listening intently. Angela found herself surrounded by colleagues offering congratulations, apologies, and in some cases, hesitant olive branches. The atmosphere at St. Mary's had shifted dramatically. While tension and uncertainty still lingered, there was also a palpable sense of hope and possibility. As the day progressed, Angela worked closely with Mr. Edwards and the hospital administration to begin implementing the promised changes. It was exhausting yet invigorating work, and for the first time since she had started at St. Mary's, Angela felt she was truly making a difference. That evening, as Angela prepared to leave the hospital, she saw Mr. Edwards waiting for her near the exit. "Nurse Parker," he greeted her warmly. "Or should I say, Director of Diversity Parker. How are you holding up?" Angela chuckled wearily. "It's been a day, Mr. Edwards. Honestly, I'm still processing everything." Mr. Edwards nodded in understanding. "I know it's a lot to take in, but I want you to know I have complete confidence in your ability to lead these changes. Your resilience and integrity in the face of adversity are exactly what St. Mary's needs right now." As they stepped out of the hospital together, Mr. Edwards turned to Angela with a serious expression. "You should know. What's happening here at St. Mary's is only the beginning. I plan to roll out similar changes across all Healthcare United facilities. Your story, Angela, has the power to ignite a revolution in how we approach diversity and inclusion in healthcare." Angela felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders, but instead of being burdened, she felt empowered. "I'm ready for the challenge, Mr. Edwards. Together, we can create meaningful, lasting change." As they parted ways, Angela couldn't help but reflect on how much had changed in such a short time. Days ago, she had felt isolated and on the verge of giving up. Now, she stood at the forefront of a movement with the potential to transform not just St. Mary's, but the entire healthcare industry. The road ahead would be challenging, filled with obstacles and resistance from those opposed to change. Yet, as Angela glanced back at the hospital, she felt a surge of determination. This wasn't just a job. It was an opportunity to ensure no other healthcare professional would have to endure what she had experienced. With her newfound purpose, Angela left for the evening, ready to face whatever challenges the next day might bring. In the months that followed Mr. Edwards' revelations, St. Mary's General Hospital underwent a profound transformation under Angela's leadership as the Director of Diversity. With Mr. Edwards' unwavering support, the once toxic culture began shifting toward one of inclusion and respect. Initially met with resistance, mandatory diversity and inclusion training gradually opened minds and changed hearts. Dr. Greaves, following a thorough investigation, was dismissed from his position, sending a clear message that discriminatory behavior would no longer be tolerated. The changes at St. Mary's caught the attention of the wider healthcare community, leading to Angela being invited to speak at medical conferences and diversity workshops. A year after that fateful day when Mr. Edwards intervened, Angela stood before a packed auditorium at a national healthcare conference. "Just 1 year ago," Angela began, "I was a nurse, struggling to find my place. Today, I stand before you as living proof that change is possible, that one voice can make a difference." She shared the story of St. Mary's transformation, candidly addressing the challenges they faced, but also celebrating the victories, the lives touched, the minds changed, and the culture rebuilt. After the seminar, Mr. Edwards, now fully recovered, approached Angela with his signature warm smile. "Angela," he greeted her, "you've come a long way from the nurse I met a year ago." They discussed the progress at St. Mary's and the ripple effects it was having on the healthcare industry. Mr. Edwards shared that several other hospitals in the Healthcare United network had begun implementing similar programs. "You know, Angela," Mr. Edwards said thoughtfully, "when I came to St. Mary's after my skiing accident, I could never have imagined the journey it would set in motion. You've not only transformed St. Mary's, you've reignited my passion for this work." As Angela prepared to return to St. Mary's, she reflected on her incredible journey, from an isolated, disheartened nurse to a leader and changemaker. She had come so far, but the work was far from over. Angela felt a renewed sense of hope and determination as she stepped into the hospital. Sarah, once a cold colleague, now greeted her as a staunch ally. The hospital buzzed with a newfound energy as staff collaborated and communicated in ways they never had before. In the main lobby, Angela paused before a new mural depicting a diverse team of healthcare professionals working together. The plaque beneath it read, "Diversity is our strength. Inclusion is our commitment. Compassion is our calling." As Angela settled into her office, ready to face new challenges, she smiled. The transformation of St. Mary's was just the beginning. The real work of changing hearts, minds, and an entire system was ongoing, and she was ready for it all.